My promotion to captain came on the first day of May, 1943. Shigure's skipper, Lieutenant Commander Kimio Yamagami, gave a party in my honor. The officers crowded the gunroom to congratulate me and toast me with sake. After a couple of drinks, Yamagami said hesitatingly, "The crew has been working hard for the past 40 days without any real relaxation. I see that factory ship Akashi is showing the movie tonight. Do you think I might allow the men to go see it?" It pained me to refuse this reasonable request, but I explained, "I know we are on a rough schedule, 7 days a week, but it is necessary. Do not think me harsh, but we cannot afford to let up one bit at this critical time." That silenced Yamagami, a very mild man, but Lieutenant Toshio Doi, the torpedo officer, spoke up, "Captain Hara, forgive my bluntness, but I don't understand why the men can't have some respite. They would be invigorated by a little recreation, and they certainly deserve it." "Doi," I answered, "this may also seem blunt, but our crew has never been in battle, where the slightest mistake may mean death for ship and shipmates as well as oneself. They may curse me now and think me harsh for imposing this rigorous training. But I want you, their officers, to understand that I insist on this regimen because it is better for them to suffer here in training than to be killed by the enemy." The brief, clumsy silence that followed was broken by Lieutenant Hiroshi Kainuma, the chief engineer. "Gentlemen, I share Captain Hara's feelings. In recent months many of our destroyers have been sunk, and Captain Hara has seen it happen. We are lucky to have a division commander of his experience. Let us set a proper example, quit beefing, and take advantage of his skill and experience. Those of us who do not know enough to appreciate him now, will find out before long how grateful they should be to Captain Hara." Yamagami proposed a final toast to me, in which all the officers joined. The party broke up and we all went to night combat stations. Walking back to the bridge, I said to Yamagami, "I feel sorry for you, skipper, having to put up with a son of a bitch like me who dictates so concerning your crew. Normally a division commander leaves the running of a ship to her captain. I cannot explain further why I am compelled to take charge in Shigure. But I do appreciate your cooperativeness, and hope that you will someday understand." Yamagami nodded meekly. Had he been forceful or obdurate as Shigure's skipper, he could have made my task most unpleasant. Fortunately for me, he was most cooperative and obliging. After 6 weeks of training, Shigure was assigned to guard duties at Truk. This involved escorting transport ships in and out of the harbor, and also being on the lookout for enemy submarines. These light duties did not interrupt my training program in any way. Meanwhile, the overall war situation was not improving for Japan. After withdrawing from Guadalcanal, Japanese forces fell back to dig in on other islands up the Solomons chain. But the enemy's offensive capability seemed to be growing far faster than Japan's defensive capability. Admiral Mineichi Koga, who succeeded Admiral Yamamoto as Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet, continued the tactics of his predecessor. Destroyers and light cruisers were committed piecemeal into battle. These expendable elements, working desperately day and night, scored occasional local victories, but failed to change the tide of the war. With the retreat from Guadalcanal, Japan's most forward defense line in the Solomons lay in the New Georgia Group. There were bases at Munda on the main island and at nearby Kolombangara, with a total of about 10,500 troops in the area. It was here that the U.S. Navy drove a wedge on June 30, 1943, with landings on the northern tip of Rindova Island, and at Vangunu Island. These landings posed a threat to the Japanese bases, and Admiral Koga ordered maximum reinforcements for the garrison troops. Our destroyers were again called into action on Tokyo Express assignments for this ferry service. Carrying tremendous loads of men and supplies, these ships fought fierce battles against better equipped and numerically superior enemy forces on the 4th, 6th, 12th, and 19th of July. In spite of distinct disadvantages, these plucky little ships gave good accounts of themselves. Particularly brilliant were the exploits of 5 destroyers in Kula Gulf on the night of July 12. Indeed, their success outshone the November battle off Guadalcanal in which I had taken part, and the famed Tanaka action of November 30 in the same vicinity. In the Kula Gulf battle, a Japanese force of light cruiser Jintsu and destroyers Yukikaze, my old teammate Hamikaze, Mikazuki, Ayanami, and Yugure took on an allied force consisting of 2 U.S. and 1 New Zealand cruisers and 10 destroyers. The engagement opened around midnight when Jintsu repeated battleship Hiei's blunder of using searchlights and was promptly sunk by concentrated gunfire. In the ensuing action, cruiser Leander was knocked out by torpedoes. The Allies made the mistake of dividing into two groups. One of these, consisting of 4 destroyers, failed to engage any Japanese ships. The 5 Japanese destroyers, storming back and forth, completely outmaneuvered the other group, knocking out cruisers Street, Louis and Honolulu and sinking destroyer Gwyn. In the confusion, destroyers Woodworth and Buchanan collided, and the Japanese ships returned to base, damaged but triumphant. Yet the loss of that one cruiser was more costly to Japan than were the casualties Yukikaze and her colleagues inflicted on 3 cruisers and 3 destroyers of the Allies. At Truk I heard of Yukikaze's exploits with some envy. She had not had great achievement in battle when teamed with my Amatsukaze in late 1942, but she was the only ship to survive the Bismarck Sea battle without a scratch. With her Kula Gulf exploit she was becoming a ship of some note. I vowed to match her exploits with my Shigur when we were ordered to move to Rabaul on July 20. I was glad to get the orders. So far I had been a division commander in name only, since all my ships but Shigur were assigned to other commands. 2 of my destroyers, Yugure and Ariake, were at Rabaul. It was stimulating to think of having 3 of my ships together at one time. I knew that Yugure, having just come from earning glory with Yukikaze in the Kula Gulf battle, would be a great asset to the division. My feelings were shared by Shigur's entire crew, and their morale soared when they heard of Yugure's exploits. They were tired after almost 4 months of intensive training, but they rejoiced at the prospect of moving to the front and having the chance to engage in battle. Shigur headed south at a steady 18 knots, loaded to capacity with plane parts badly needed at Rabaul. I thought of how the weeks of recent training had transformed Shigur's sloppy, dispirited crew into a snappy, hard-working team. I had been very sparing with praise during their training, but they had done a good job. Still, experience had taught me that one real action teaches more than 1,000 maneuvers. I would save my praise until they had withstood their baptism of fire, and hope that the acid test would not find them wanting. I was eager for battle. Yukikaze had been successful, and if she could succeed, we could. The voyage to Rabaul was eventless and we arrived on July 23. I reported at once to the headquarters where a staff officer silently handed me a report. I scanned it hastily and was stunned. Destroyers Yugure and Kiyonami had been sunk south of Schwazurl on the 20th. They were part of a transport mission to Kolombangara which had been thwarted a week earlier and were trying again. The entire crews had perished, 228 in Yugure and 240 in Kiyonami. Thus the enemy had avenged their losses at Kula Gulf within a week. As soon as Shigur's cargo was unloaded I told the crew what had happened to the 2 destroyers. They listened in silence and, I gathered, began to feel that all their training had been worth the effort. Destroyer Division 27 was still my command in name only. But Ariake returned on the 2 LST with 2 other destroyers from a successful supply mission to Kolombangara. This trio had chosen Vela Gulf as their approach route instead of Kula Gulf. A powerful enemy force of 4 cruisers and 3 destroyers were on the prowl in Kula Gulf, but they did not find out until too late that the Japanese destroyers had entered and departed on the other side of the island. Rabaul supply base for all Japanese forces in both the Solomon Islands. And the New Guinea theaters was a hectic place in the summer of 1943. Destroyer Shigur was allowed to rest but checkups, familiarization cruises, and the like, kept it from being a rest for just 6 days when orders arrived to join with 3 ships of Destroyer Division 4 on a transport mission to Kolombangara. We were to take the route through Vela Gulf that had been used so successfully by Ariake 10 days earlier, because, headquarters said, this route was safe enough. I did not share this complacency, however, because of my observation that a repetition of the same operational formula usually ended disastrously. We should not expect that the enemy's cruisers and destroyers would again obligingly waste time and fuel in Kula Gulf. The tragedy of Yugure and Kiyonami should have been example enough that we could not count on the enemy for such stupidity. On the 1st of August, we steamed out of Rabaul in a column led by Amagiri. As lead ship and scout for the force, she carried no cargo. The following 3 destroyers Hagakaze, Arashi, Shigur were loaded with a total of 900 troops and 120 tons of supplies. I was apprehensive on my first real sortie of the year. In my absence from action, the seas of the Central Solomons had claimed many illustrious destroyers. Kagero, Kuroshio, and Oyashio, veterans of Tanaka's victorious battle off Savo Island, were sunk by mines and air attack on May 8, 1943. My Java Sea battle teammate, Nagatsuki, and Niyazuki were lost in these waters in July. Hatsuyuki, hero of the October, 1942, Savo Island battle, was blasted into the ocean depths, near Bougainville on July 17. I became lost in these contemplations on Chagur's bridge, watching the darkening ocean, and wondered how many and which of the 4 ships on this sortie would survive. As night came, I was relieved to see that it was pitch dark, and hoped that luck would be with us. We entered Blackett Strait, which threads between Kolombangara and 3 smaller islands to the southwest. Both sides of this hazardous, narrow waterway are lined for miles with dangerous reefs and shoals. Engines were stopped at the rendezvous point and our 3 loaded ships drifted in silence. Dozens of barges came swiftly out from shore to receive our cargo. Working very efficiently, they cleared our ships of all troops and supplies within 20 minutes. It was a great relief to see Hagake's hooded lamp signal, "Let's go home." Amagiri went ahead to lead the way while the other 3 of us warmed engines, and within 5 minutes we were headed back through the weird and treacherous waterway. I had alerted Chagur's bridge and lookouts for any sign of danger. The enemy with his tight scout networks in this area must have detected our activities, and might spring out from any of the myriad shoals that lined the maze-like strait. 10 minutes after getting underway from the rendezvous, we were making 30 knots through the confined waters. This was a truly breakneck speed for such a dangerous waterway. In peacetime, no ship would have ventured here at night in excess of 12 knots, even with all lights burning. We of course were running fully blacked out. The night was sultry, but cold sweat stood out on every brow. We passed Arandel and Wana Wana, and caught up with Amagiri as we drew a beam of Gizo. We then drew into a tight column formation with only 500 meters between ships. My eyes, well adjusted to the darkness, suddenly caught the movement of a small black object moving swiftly from the left toward Amagiri, which was some 1,500 meters ahead of Chagur. I could not determine what the object was, but groaned, "Here it comes," and braced for a fearsome explosion at any moment. The black object melted into the darkness and was gone, with no explosion, no flash, no fire. It was mystifying. The suggestion of bustling activity on board Amagiri was borne out when her veiled lamp flashed a swift message: enemy torpedo boats encountered. 1 rammed and sunk. Hagakaze and Arashi machine guns suddenly barked and I saw them fire a torrent of bullets to starboard. 2 violently burning torpedo boats came into view near the 2 destroyers. I gave the order for Chagur's guns to open fire, and the crews, who had been standing by with fingers on triggers, responded beautifully. The flaming craft disappeared into the black water as if they had never existed. These 2 burning torpedo boats must have been the 2 halves of PT-109. Cheers of joy and laughter sounded and echoed in each of our destroyers as we continued running at top speed. I understood the elation at our good fortune, but could not join the merrymaking. My spine was still creeping at the thought of the close shave we had had, as I recalled the loss of Teratsuki in December 1942 to motor torpedo boats. This new Japanese destroyer of 3,470 tons was sunk as the result of 2 hits by torpedoes delivered by a couple of 50-ton torpedo boats. The same fate could have just as well befallen us this night if the enemy had spotted us and reacted a few minutes earlier. Outside of Vela Gulf, we slackened speed and returned uneventfully to Rabaul. Our crews were still exultant about the victory, but I was apprehensive and glum. Reason for the glumness appeared when I reported to headquarters and received an official report that awaited me. I returned sadly to Chagur, once again commander of a 1-ship division. How swift the tempo of attrition! Of the glorious quintet of July, only 2 ships remained a month later. How could both Mikazuki and Ariake have been so clumsy and inept as to run aground? Depressed and dispirited, I downed several bottles of sake that night. Yamagami joined me in drowning sorrow for an hour or so and then retired. I stayed up and drank myself into a stupor. 2 days later, on the morning of August 4, Captain Kaju Sugiura, commander of Destroyer Division 4, invited Yamagami and me to his flagship to attend a conference. The day was sunny and we had a pleasant boat ride over to destroyer Hagakaze. The conference table and chairs set up on the foredeck were shaded by a small awning. We were the last to arrive and the skippers and execs of the other destroyers gave us a cordial greeting. Sugiura, several years my senior and a staff college graduate, opened the conference with a general greeting and then stated the business of the day. Gentlemen, I am very happy to report that our last transport mission to Kolombangara was a complete success, thanks to your splendid cooperation. Both the Navy and the Army High Command are gratified and have asked me to extend their appreciation to you. They have also ordered that the mission be repeated the day after tomorrow. Kawakaze will replace Amagiri, whose nose was bruised in ramming that torpedo boat. I invite discussion and will welcome your opinions and suggestions. Looking around I saw that the skippers of Sugiura's destroyers were listening with impassive obedience. They would offer no dissenting voice to anything Sugiura said. Yamagami, of my Shigur, was squirming uneasily. Being the only other officer of captain rank in the conference, I spoke up. Captain Sugiura, I understood you to say that we are to repeat the mission. Does that mean we are to conduct this operation in the same way as the last one? Yes, Hara. We shall go through Vela Gulf and Blackett Strait again, and unload at the Kolombangara anchorage at 23:30, exactly as we did last time. Begging your pardon, Sugiura, I do not think it wise to repeat the exact same formula again. This same procedure has already been used twice in Vela Gulf. Can't we vary the course somewhat this time? Blackett Strait by itself, with all those reefs and shoals, is unhealthy enough, without using the identical route for getting there again. How about feinting through Gizo Strait before sneaking into Blackett? Or how about just changing the timing by 2 hours either way? Hara, I see your point, but I already have my orders. To alter them in any detail such as you suggest would involve great changes for all parties concerned, especially in communications. And you know how poor the Army garrison's communication system is. If Blackett Strait is unhealthy for us, it is dangerous for the enemy too. Their torpedo boats can get lost in the maze of reefs before they spot us. Sugiura's 3 skippers meekly nodded their agreement. It was plain that any counter-proposals I might make would be opposed by everyone except Yamagami. I felt a bit dizzy. My ears heard the din of the words from Musashi Miyamoto's memoir, "It is bad to repeat a formula, and to repeat it a third time is worse. When the opponent thinks high, hit low. When he thinks low, hit high." Sugiura was no stranger to me. We had been friends for many years. He was highly regarded by our superiors. There were already indications that he would reach flag rank. A man in such circumstances seldom argues when the high command gives orders. He broke the silence and continued in a conciliatory tone. "If it is agreeable with you, Hara, I should like to have Shigur be scout ship for the force. That will free you from carrying burdensome cargo and give you a free hand. The former scout ship, Amagiri, has been replaced by Kawakaze and the crew lacks experience. With your experience and skill, you would do a perfect job of scouting for the force." This was a clever move on Sugiura's part. It tended to place me, his only vocal opponent to following the operation orders, in the position of having to accept from him a favored position of responsibility in this operation. All eyes were on me, awaiting my response. Fortunately I was able to answer with complete truthfulness. "I appreciate your consideration, Sugiura, but cannot accept your proposal." My listeners could not have been more surprised, and the skippers looked appalled at my having answered in this fashion. I continued, "Shigur, a sluggish and creaking hulk, is the oldest of our 4. Its 42,000 horsepower engine needs overhaul so badly I doubt if she can make 30 knots. She is unfit for scout duty. I recommend that this duty be assigned to Commander Koshichi Sugioka in Arashi. His new ship, with its 52,000 horsepower engine, can easily make 35 knots. Sugiura squirmed slightly as an awkward silence prevailed. He looked at Sugioka, who averted his gaze and said nothing. Mild-tempered Sugiura finally broke the silence with a sigh of resignation. "Very well, gentlemen," he said. "Flagship Hagakaze will lead the column and serve as scout ship, but she will carry her share of troops and supplies. Following her will come Arashi, Kawakaze, and Shigur will bring up the rear, with 500 meters distance between ships. This will give us a compact but maneuverable formation. Is that satisfactory, Hara?" In view of his tolerance and patience with me, I had to agree with this arrangement. It was obviously futile to question the wisdom of the operation itself. The conference moved into a discussion of technical details. The plan was to leave Rabaul early in the morning so as to arrive in the area covered by the enemy's Brussels-based air patrols after nightfall. Sugiura assumed that these U.S. patrol planes covered a range of 300 miles. His assumption was probably right as of a week earlier. But we had no right to assume that patrols might not now come from the more advanced base at Rendova, which had been in operation since early July. Also, our force could be spotted by enemy submarines. But this was not taken into consideration. The more I thought about these things, the more upset and uneasy I became. Still too clear in my mind was the miserable fate of the 2 ships of my division which were lost while under another command. The conference lasted about 2 hours. I remained silent and glum as we departed for Shigur. In the boat, Yamagami said, "Captain, I was surprised at your courage in speaking up like that. But I am afraid those Destroyer Division 4 officers took a dim view of your contentions. It was not a matter of courage so much as saying what I had to say. As to what they think of me, I do not care. But I do care for men's lives. This operation, at best, is unreasonable. Now I simply pray that luck will be with us." I have always looked back on that conference with deep regret. I should not have yielded to the idiotic policy of the High Command. Had my views prevailed, hundreds of lives might have been saved in a single operation and many times that number in ensuing months. Yet under the strict hierarchy of command prevailing in the Navy, there was no way my objections could have any effect. I learned later that even my futile protest at the beginning of the conference aroused much criticism of me when word of it spread among the officers at Rabaul. We sortied from Rabaul on August 6 at 0300 and headed southward in a calm sea. The cloudy sky offered intermittent rain squalls and brief glimpses of sunshine. We were passing Buka Island at 14:30 when an enemy patrol plane was seen disappearing into the clouds. Our radioman reported hearing an urgent coded message, which must have been the plane's report of our approach. Clearly, our operation would not take the enemy by surprise. I kept close watch of flagship Hagakaze to see how Captain Sugiura would react to this development. It grieved me to see our same speed of advance and course maintained, even after we had been sighted by the enemy. I gritted my teeth and followed along. We entered Bougainville Strait at 19 and, turning to a course of 140 degrees, boosted speed to 30 knots. 2 hours and 20 minutes later we were directly northeast of Vella Lavella Island. Shigur was falling behind the formation as the 30-knot speed proved too much for her. The navigation officer, Lieutenant Yoshio Tsukihara, came to report to me. "Sir, we are lagging 1,000 meters behind Kawakaze. Shall we use the overboost to gain back our lost 500 meters? No, I roared. This is good enough. To hell with the prescribed 500-meter distance. Don't overboost the engine. Kolombangara loomed to starboard, its towering volcanic peak overhung with ominous black clouds. To port I could see nothing but blackness, from which anything could emerge at any moment. It made my spine creep. I shouted new orders. Stand by for action. Aim all guns and torpedoes to port. Set gun range of 3,000 meters. Set torpedoes to run at 2-meter depth, angle 20 degrees. Double all lookouts. For the next 10 uneasy minutes I peered searchingly to port for some sign of activity or movement to betray the presence of the enemy. Visibility was no more than 2,000 meters in this direction. The growing tension was shattered by the voice tube from torpedo control where Lieutenant Doi asked if it was all right to return the tubes from portside to their original starboard position. I shrieked an emphatic no and followed with a more controlled explanation. "No, Doi, for heaven's sake. No, starboard visibility is so good that we can see the reefs of Vella Lavella. To port we see no more than 2,000 meters, and we don't know where the enemy is. Stay trained to port and be ready for action at any moment." This bit of instruction was hardly finished when Lookout Yamashita called, "White waves. Black objects. Several ships heading toward us." I called at once for full starboard helm, and ordered torpedoes launched at portside targets. The white waves were plainly visible. I shuddered and glanced at the 3 leading destroyers. They were proceeding straight ahead, oblivious of the closing enemy ships. Damn! Damn! Shiger was now 1,500 meters behind Kawakazi. 45 seconds after the order was given, Shiger began swinging to starboard as her torpedoes leapt in rapid succession into the water. The time was 21:45. As the 8th torpedo was about to be released, I caught sight of telltale white torpedo tracks fanning out in our direction, the nearest within 800 meters. I shouted again for hard starboard helm. In the same moment I saw a pillar of fire shoot up from amidship of Arashi, and 2 from Kawakazi. Lead ship Hagakazi was beyond and in line with these 2 victims so that I could not see her. Looking again at the water, I held my breath. 3 torpedoes were streaking toward Shiger's bow, which was swinging rapidly to the right. My knees almost gave in as I clutched the handrail. The first torpedo passed 20 meters ahead of the bow, the second was closer, and the third appeared certain to hit. It did not, however, or if it did, it was just a glancing blow on the skin of the rapidly turning ship. I thought I felt a dull thud from aft but could not be sure. Looking around again, I saw several torpedoes running 30 meters or more in front of the bow, as the ship was completing a full circle in its desperate evasive turn. I called for a reverse turn. Port helm, half. When a destroyer is running at 30 knots, it takes the better part of a minute for the helm to answer the wheel. I looked around anxiously. Fortunately, there were no more torpedoes in sight, and I had a chance to look at my watch. It was 21:47. Those 2 minutes just past were the most breathtaking ones of my life. Lookout Yamashita announced gleefully that one of our torpedoes had scored a hit, raising a great explosion amid the enemy ships. This was a needed shot in the arm for the men and officers of Shiger who had been wondering when their own ship would be hit. Shouts of joy were short-lived when it appeared that no enemy ships had been hit. It was later ascertained that the exploding torpedo observed by Yamashita had been triggered upon crossing the wake of one of the enemy destroyers. The Japanese oxygen-fueled torpedoes were so sensitive that they often exploded upon hitting a ship's wake. But no American ships were hit in the action. The enemy performed superbly that night, and did everything right. I felt certain that some of my torpedoes were going to hit, but the enemy destroyers made a 90-degree turn to the east just in time to evade us. I asked the radio room what had been heard from our other destroyers. The reply came back at once. Arashi and Kawakazi sent brief messages saying they were hit by torpedoes. We have heard nothing from Hagakazi. After ordering that efforts be continued to keep contact, I ordered a smokescreen to mask our movements. Then I wondered what to do next. Shiger was heading northwest, away from the battle zone. I could not quit like this. A quick review of the situation convinced me that the enemy had ambushed us brilliantly, and that Shiger was now at a distinct disadvantage. I recalled the night off Guadalcanal when my ship made a solo run against the enemy column and sank destroyer Barton. Now the tables were turned. The enemy was coming at me, and it was no solo run for them. Judging from the many torpedo tracks we could see, several ships must have fired in concert. The hits on Arashi and Kawakazi were phenomenal. Never before had I seen such marksmanship by the enemy. We had been taking altogether too casual a view of his torpedo technique. The Americans took full advantage of the situation this night. I could not leave my friends in the lurch, and yet there was little I could do against an opposition greatly outnumbering us. With no message from Hagakazi, there was always the chance that she was still afloat. I ordered torpedoes prepared and announced that we were going back to fight. It was 21:51 as Shiger turned around. A minute later, tremendous fireworks filled the sky some 3 miles ahead. Torrents of flares and flaming projectiles shot up in every direction with blinding brightness. The enemy was bombarding our destroyers, which were soon in their death throes. While Shiger made way toward this holocaust, I asked for reports of radio contacts with our other ships and of our own readiness for battle. There was no answer to our call, and I learned that Shiger's rudder was not functioning properly. The thought came back to me of the ominous thud I had heard earlier. It was not until Shiger went into dry dock 4 months later that we found in the rudder a hole nearly 2 feet across. An American torpedo had passed right through it without exploding. I was in agony on the bridge. Handicapped with a load of 250 troops and tons of deck cargo, how could this destroyer fight single-handed against the odds of an apparently undamaged enemy force? At Guadalcanal I had made 3 mistakes and lost 43 men. How many mistakes would there be this time? And how many men would I lose? Shiger was still approaching the scene of action when the gunfire ceased abruptly at 22:10. The area was thrown into complete darkness and it seemed certain that our 3 companion ships were sunk. The triumphant enemy must be waiting in the darkness for just the right moment to jump Shiger. When a final check showed no response from our other ships, at 22:15 I gave the order to withdraw. It was a hard decision but there was no alternative. We informed Rabaul that we were ready to leave the area and requested instructions. Headquarters came back at once saying, "Return to base. Ask Kolombangara to rescue survivors." Thus ended the Battle of Vella Gulf in a perfect American victory. 3 Japanese destroyers were sunk. Of their 700 crewmen and 820 troops, only 310 survived. Among them was Captain Sugiura. He had drifted ashore some 30 hours after the sinkings and roamed the jungles for a week before being rescued by a search party. It pained me to see Sugiura when he returned to Rabaul on August 20, emaciated and ashamed. Survivors recounted how they had seen the fatal torpedoes only within a few hundred meters of their ships. 2 torpedo hits on Hagakazi had instantly silenced her radio. Arashi was hit by 3 torpedoes and Kawakazi by 2. It was one of the most astounding torpedo successes in history. An 8th enemy torpedo hit Shiger's rudder. Had it not been a dud, Shiger would have shared the fate of the 3 destroyers of Destroyer Division 4. The American score for this action was very high by any standard, and it was shockingly so to Japanese experts who thought the enemy weak in torpedo effectiveness. It was not until after the war that I read American versions of this battle and found how the victory had been won. Our destroyers had walked into a shrewdly laid trap which took full advantage of the cloaking Kolombangara Mountains. The enemy had learned of our approach early and kept track of our force throughout the day. 6 American destroyers had left Tulagi at 9:30, and they were well informed of our movements toward Vella Gulf. In the Gulf these ships' radar picked us up at a range of almost 10 miles. Thereupon the enemy force split into 2 groups of 3 ships each. Dunlap, Craven and Maury were to make the first torpedo run, the others to follow as needed. The shooting of the first group was so good that the second group needed to join only in the finishing gunfire. The victory would have been perfect if they had pursued Shiger. But our smokescreen must have been effective in making the enemy think we were done for. The significance of the American victory was finally realized at Rabaul. Never again did headquarters try to reinforce Kolombangara through Vella Gulf. Shiger returned late in the night of August 7 to Rabaul, where headquarters was in a turmoil. Our loss of Munda on the 4th, followed by the unprecedented defeat of our destroyers in Vella Gulf, was a shock to everyone. Across the narrow Blackett Strait from Munda was the main Japanese bastion of the Solomons, Kolombangara. I could understand why the enemy destroyers opposing us at Vella fought with such authority. I was greeted ruefully by the 8th Fleet Commander, Vice Admiral Tomoshige Sanjima, but he said not a word of criticism of my actions. He was remorseful at having sent Destroyer Division 4 into a trap, on a foolish repeat mission. On return to my ship I had the 250 army troops and their supplies put ashore. Most of the soldiers were terribly sick after huddling more than 40 hours in the cramped, stinking spaces below deck. They shouted with joy as they staggered down the ramp to solid land. They realized what a narrow escape we had had, and bowed a grateful farewell to Shiger and her crew as they marched away. It made me feel that my decision had been the right one. I gave my crew the next day off and let them go ashore, 1/3 at a time. It was their first real rest, and a well-earned one. When I saw Petty Officer Yamashita, the lookout who had discovered the enemy, among the first group to go ashore, I called him to my cabin. There I handed him my silver watch and said, "You did a great job. I want you to have this. It is not much. I bought it 20 years ago, at Wanamaker's department store in New York City." "I cannot accept it, sir," Yamashita protested. "I must not take a thing of such special significance for you. I merely fulfilled my duty. If my act deserved a reward, it should come from headquarters. Take the watch and stop arguing with me, Yamashita. The High Command will not give you anything. They have actually denied our claimed torpedo hit because your sighting was not witnessed." "Oh, Captain Hara, that is wrong. I saw the torpedo hit just as I saw the approaching enemy. I have never lied in my life, and will fight anyone who calls me a liar. Come, now, Yamashita. You know how the service can be." "Forget it. Go ashore and have a good time. I put the watch in his pocket. He looked bewildered for a moment, smiled, saluted, and withdrew. I sat down to the difficult job of writing a detailed action report of the Vella Gulf battle. I had to be honest, and at the same time I wanted to defend my colleagues. Hours passed before the work was completed. As I stepped out on deck to relax, the first shore party was returning. Yamashita stood out from the rest of the group because of his disheveled uniform, swollen face and blackened eye. When I called for an explanation, he stammered, "It is nothing, sir. I just stumbled and fell. You said this morning that you do not lie. Don't try to fool me. Do you think I cannot tell when a man has been beaten up? I am very sorry, sir. Forgive me for telling you the first lie of my life. I tangled with some bastards ashore, but they did not beat me up. Come to my cabin and explain what happened." This usually cocky young man followed sheepishly to my cabin. There I demanded a full explanation. "Well, sir, I had a few drinks and was having a good time. Maybe I got a little drunk. I showed off the watch you gave me. Then some son of a bitch said that Shiger had retreated in shame and was a disgrace to the Navy. Another joined in saying that Destroyer Division 27 was a bunch of bums. That did it. I lit into both of them and gave them what they deserved. The bastards. Shame on you, Yamashita. Do you think Shiger's action was wrong? No, sir. I believe your judgment was absolutely right. That's why these bastards made me mad. You should have ignored them. We are here to fight the enemy, not our countrymen. Don't feel bad about it now. Blow your nose and go to sick bay for treatment. Next time you will know better." The atmosphere in Shiger changed radically after Vella Gulf. The crew was transformed overnight into a proud, tightly woven team. No more beefing, no more sullen faces. This happy development made our whole ordeal of training and battle worthwhile. This team would have confidence in its next battle. And it was not long in coming. The Americans continued their advance and carried out a new landing operation on August 15 at Baloa, near the southern end of Vella La Vella. This new beachhead and the one at Munda formed a pincer on our 12,000-man garrison at Kolombangara. The reaction of the Japanese High Command was to throw in all available aircraft over Baloa and then land reinforcements at Horniu, on Vella La Vella, to counterattack the new enemy beachhead. On the morning of August 16, Yamagami and I attended a conference in Destroyer Sazanami, presided over by the commander of Destroyer Squadron 3, Rear Admiral Matsuji Ijuin. It had already been announced that he would lead the Horniu operation in person. When ordered to direct this operation, Ijuin said, "I urged the High Command to discontinue the use of destroyers for transport purposes. Accordingly, our destroyers will function purely as escorts. Escort squadrons of a year ago never had fewer than 8 destroyers, but we must be content with 4 because of the high attrition rate of recent months. But I have handpicked these 4 outstanding ships, and I know that their fighting strength will be as the strength of 8. Ijuin then asked me to brief the conference on the Vella Gulf action, and he listened just as intently as the others. When I had finished, he spoke again. "I wholeheartedly endorse Hara's remarks and I commend to you his actions in that battle. Remember his cautiousness and flexibility. In the present operation our duty is to guard the convoy, not to seek duels. I disapprove of the dogged inflexibility which has proved such a detriment to our navy." This reference to the 4 ships as the best at Rabaul was no mere flattery. My Shiger was the only one which was not of the very latest type. Hamikaze, hero of the July 13 battle at Kula Gulf, was one of the rare Japanese warships to be equipped at this time with radar. She and sister ship Isokaze formed Destroyer Division 17, commanded by Captain Toshio Miyazaki. These and Ijuin's own flagship, Sazanami, formed the escort for the operation. This little squadron could boast the rare lineup of a rear admiral and 2 captains. Furthermore, Ijuin, with his stress on flexibility, gave each of his captains a free hand in making preparations, and the freedom allowed to Ijuin by the High Command showed how impressed they had been by the Vella Gulf debacle. This 4-ship squadron left Rabaul at 0300 on August 17, and sped southward to rendezvous with our convoy of 20 small landing barges. They set out from Bin, Bougainville, at 10:27 the same day, carrying 400 reinforcements for Horniu. We were still within 100 miles of Rabaul when our radio intercepted a message from an airplane very nearby. Since the enemy thus knew of our movements, It was essential that we learn what we could of his. Accordingly, Ijuin promptly radioed the Bin air station to double its scout plane missions. The first message from any of our scout planes came at 13:30, just as Bougainville appeared on the southwestern horizon. The sighting report said, 3 large enemy destroyers in Gizo Strait headed toward Baloa. This information was received in our force with mixed feelings. I was relieved to know something about the enemy's movements. It was so much better than my last mission when we had to advance with no knowledge of the enemy deployment. Our ships were bent on 28 knots toward Bougainville Strait. We had to rush lest the enemy mauled the unescorted convoy which was advancing slowly along the Choiseul coast. The sun set while we sped through Bougainville Strait. The night's full moon was obscured by heavy weather. Clouds hovered at 1,500 feet, and visibility was no more than 3 miles. These conditions favored the enemy with his vastly superior radar, and we knew it. At 21 Vela La Vela loomed dead ahead on the horizon. We were nearing our goal and, very likely, a showdown with the 3 enemy destroyers. The tense silence of our march was suddenly broken by the booming voice of Lookout Yamashita, enemy plane. A sleek bomber swung overhead and disappeared into the low clouds. Just as suddenly, another plane, which appeared to be an Avenger bomber, edged out of the clouds to drop a white flare directly above Chagrin. Our destroyers broke column instantly and spread out, with all guns barking at the enemy plane. We zigzagged at 30 knots and laid smoke screens, each destroyer following prescribed procedure. Another bomber came out of the clouds and dove toward Sazanami, almost scraping the flagship's masts as it flew over and released several bombs. Skip bombing, I thought, and clenched my fists in anxiety. It had been a constant nightmare for me in the 5 months since I had first heard of this new air attack method. My wrestling with the problem of how to evade such assaults had failed to produce any solution. The bombs aimed at Sazanami, however, did not skip. They were dropped in a conventional dive bombing and they missed, raising several white columns of water around the flagship. Sazanami's guns replied but failed to score on the daring attacker. I relaxed with relief that our ships were undamaged and the plane gone. But there was now great likelihood that more would return. Far ahead we caught sight of the convoy we were to guard. It would be an hour before we could catch up. I tried to figure what we would do if the enemy came back with many planes, but such thoughts were broken by another shout from Yamashita. This time there were 2 enemy planes. One twin-engined bomber dived on lead ship Sazanami. The other struck the opposite end of our column, at Chagrin. All our guns greeted this audacious pilot who dove literally between our masts in laying his deadly eggs, before zooming up in a sharp climb. Some of our shells must have caught that bomber for, as it was about to disappear into the clouds, we saw the left wing spurting fire. When the bombs missed Chagrin, I looked toward Sazanami. She was wreathed in a very thorough smokescreen. I knew she would be safe from the attack of such mediocre bomber pilots as these. Before it was over, a total of 8 bombers assailed us in this running battle which lasted almost until we reached the mouth of Vela Gulf. As the last of the planes departed, the ominous, black silhouette of Kolombangara towered over us from the east. Everything was again in pitch darkness. Were we walking into another enemy trap? From the radio room voice tube, Sazanami orders 180° turn to the west, because of poor visibility on Kolombangara side. I was happy to obey that order, and Chagrin turned immediately. Our 4 destroyers rejoined and started a westward march. We had gone nearly 30 miles when Sazanami signaled. 4 enemy ships bearing 190°, distant 15,000 meters. Admiral Ijuin had kept us out of an enemy ambush. Sazanami's stern signal light kept blinking. Form combat column. Prepare for torpedo attack to port. Ijuin later told me how overjoyed he was to find that the enemy was pursuing us. I was positive that the enemy, overconfident after his phenomenal August 6 victory, had decided to ignore the vulnerable unescorted convoy, and challenge us to a duel. I headed north to lure the enemy into battle at a safe distance from the convoy. At 22:32 our destroyers turned 45° to a northwest heading, while every eye was glued to the movement of the enemy. The combat column order had shifted the positions of our ships so that radar-equipped Hamikaze was closest to the enemy and covering Sazanami, and my Chagrin was another 1,000 meters northward. The enemy's continued speeding to the northeast indicated that he was not yet aware of our irregular turnaround. The distance between our forces was shrinking steadily when, at 22:40, a brilliant blue and white flare blossomed above the enemy column. That signal dropped by one of our scout planes meant, enemy ships or destroyers, the U.S. column started a rapid, sharp turn to the west. This was a shock to Ijuin, who realized that the enemy was breaking off his chase of our destroyers. This meant that the enemy would charge against our unprotected barges. Ijuin immediately ordered a 90-degree turn to the southwest for his destroyers, and called for a calculation of the enemy's speed. It appeared shortly that our destroyers could not possibly reach the enemy destroyers before they lit into our defenseless barges. Ijuin ordered, fired torpedoes on long-range setting. He estimated the distance between Sazanami and the enemy to be 8,000 meters. To me it appeared to be more than 10,000 meters. At such a range there was practically no chance of scoring hits. The American ships were on an almost parallel course and making better than 30 knots. Nevertheless, a catastrophe appeared imminent and Ijuin decided to release torpedoes. At 22:52 they were launched and sped on their deadly way, 2 meters beneath the surface.